So as far as I can tell, The Last of Us Part 2 is one of the most polarizing and controversial games of the last decade. I mean, seriously, can you think of another game that has fans more evenly split between hating it and loving it? I can't think of a single other one. A lot of other games are like, oh, it's pretty good, or oh, it's pretty bad, but it's not like this. This is either you love it or you hate it. And I think largely that's well deserved. The game did some bold things narratively that were bound to upset fans. In terms of gameplay, it is stunning and very technologically impressive, but on the meta scale, what they ask the player to do over the course of the game's runtime is, once again, I'll just say bold. And thematically, it's an interesting concept that I find very artsy, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to lead to the best video game. And I think this is important to understand, like just because something makes sense in an artistic or narrative sense doesn't mean it will lead to the best video game at the end of the day. Like if I want to make a broader point about like the struggles of the lower classes and what poverty can cause in a modern society, I can make a video game where like you're tasked with doing all of this crazy stuff, but then every time you try to do it, your like checking account overdrafts and then you get evicted from your apartment, and then you get like a terrible illness and you end up in the hospital and you can't pay your bills, and then you just die alone in an empty apartment with no friends or family. Like it would hit kind of close to home for a lot of people, and it might be accurate to the modern American dream, but it wouldn't make for a very fun video game, in my opinion. I don't think many people would be like, oh, I got home from a hard day's work, living that life, I want to go and live it again. Like, I just don't think many people want to do that. And of course, it introduces interesting questions of whether video games are now at the point where they have to be fun, or if video games can be something bigger and more artsy, where you are free of that obligation to be entertaining and fun, and you can instead make a game that's important, not just fun, you know what I mean? That's all sort of besides the point. For this video, what I wanted to do is go back through some of the common protestations around The Last of Us Part 2, break down what I think are fair critiques, what I think are some that are overblown, and some straight up misinformation that I still commonly see in my comment sections of videos like this one, I'm sure, that talk about this game. To make my opinion on the game clear at the outset, I think The Last of Us Part 2 does a lot of things better than any other game I've ever played. The acting within the cutscenes is among the best I've ever seen in any piece of media, period, much less just in the video game industry. The dynamic gameplay, especially centered on the AI and stealth mechanics, is shockingly good, and I don't think anything has even come close to approaching it in the years since this game's launch. Graphically, the game is still stunning. Musically, it's fantastic, and many of those other quality of life things the game is extremely good at, which I guess makes it all the funnier that they're doing like a remastered version of the game when it really, in my opinion, doesn't need it. But what are you gonna do? That's gonna be out in a few days, so I guess that's a thing. But you know what? I don't think the game needs the graphical updates. I think it still looks amazing. And then those like side by sides, I'll have Jacob put one up here that they've posted, like the original version of the game versus the remastered version. I can't tell a difference. Like, do you see a difference here? I've tried. I can't find one. It's like those stupid puzzles where you try to figure out the difference between the two pictures and it's just the same picture over again. It's that. Maybe they're just punking us, I don't know. But like I was saying, we're gonna go through the most common frustrations and complaints with regards to The Last of Us Part 2, and I'll break down which of them I think are fair, which of them are less than fair, and how we could potentially remedy each of these items for a sequel or for whatever Naughty Dog's next game is. But as I'm sure you can figure out, there is no way for us to talk about this stuff without getting into spoiler territory. So if you are opposed to spoilers, I guess, why are you here? Like, there really is no way to talk about anything with regards to The Last of Us Part 2 without getting into spoilers. It's kind of like the whole thing of this game is tied up in the story and the story beats. So to discuss any part of it, we have to spoil it. So I guess just count this as your spoiler warning. We're gonna go through the whole story, so buckle up. And of course, a thank you to our sponsor for this video, Warframe Whispers in the Walls. Whispers in the Walls is Warframe's next big major cinematic quest line, and it's available right now. Not only does Whisper in the Walls mark the beginning of the next narrative arc within Warframe's epic sci-fi storyline and universe, but it also introduces a new secondary weapon type, the Grimoire, a new enemy type, the Murmur, a brand new hub zone called the Sanctum, new mission types, and the 55th Warframe Corvex, who uses multi-layered concrete frames and deadly radiation as weapons. If you've ever been a Warframe player, you know that they constantly raise the bar with these expansions and new quest lines, and this is just one more example of it. And best of all, you can play it today on PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X and S, PC, and more platforms like the Nintendo Switch. The very first thing we have to do when discussing The Last of Us Part 2, unfortunately, is cover the leaks that happened in April of 2020, shortly before the game's release. Now, if you recall, this was right at the outbreak of the pandemic, so things were kind of strange and mysterious. On April 2nd of 2020, Sony Interactive Entertainment did something I don't think they've done before or since, which was make the difficult decision to delay the launch of The Last of Us Part 2 and the Iron Man VR game until further notice. They just straight up put a pause on it and refused to give an actual release date, which was amazing because The Last of Us was basically supposed to be out any day at that point, and they just were like, it'll come out later. And like that was it. It was absolutely wild. And so everybody was just kind of sitting around waiting to see when it was actually going to be released. And then people saw a tweet from Naughty Dog, which was very ominous, a message from the studio. We know the last few days have been incredibly difficult for you. We feel the same. It's disappointing to see the release and sharing of pre-release footage from development. Do your best to avoid spoilers, and we ask that you don't spoil it for others. What? The game leaked. A lot of the game leaked. And it all started on Reset Era, which is a forum that commonly has game leaks and stuff. And I actually went back and found the original post in the Wayback Machine, so you can see it as it appeared on April 27th of 2020. And what's crazy about this is that there's a lot of stuff here. This is a compilation of some other leaks. They went all over the place. Some of the leaks were apparently posted to like 4chan, others were posted to other places like 8chan or something. I don't really understand most of it, but people started to collect all of these details, all of this leaked information, and creating posts like this that kind of broke it down as well as they possibly could figure out at the time. And these types of leaks are always really interesting to go through with perfect hindsight 2020 vision, right? Because we know exactly how the game works and what the story is comprised of, but at the time, they didn't know any of that. They're just looking at screen caps and like clips from the game and little still shots and video clips and stuff. They don't actually know any details about the story other than what can be seen there, and then like a leaked level list, which they also had. But other than that, they're just trying to piece together the story as best they can from that information. And this led to a lot of misinformation, things that people thought were true or were guessing at, that then started getting passed around as material fact. And it only started to upset fans more and more because some of those things that were leaked that weren't actually true seemed particularly incendiary and upsetting. Specifically from 4chan, somebody made a summary of what they believed to be the story based on all the information they had at the time. And specifically, this is the bit that really upset players. They said that you, as the player, would kill Ellie as Abby, and she leaves while realizing she's not really won in any meaningful way, since all she's done is get more of her loved ones killed for the sake of her killing Joel and Ellie. And then the ending is the cycle of revenge, with the loose implication Ellie's friends will hunt Abby down now in return. And if you've played The Last of Us Part 2, you know that's not true. That just isn't true. But I remember this going around the circles of Twitter and everywhere else, frankly, with people spoiling the game, saying that you're gonna have to play the game as Abby and then kill Ellie, and it's gonna be a whole thing. Now, granted, there are some tough sequences in The Last of Us Part 2 where, frankly, if you saw these screen caps, I can understand why you might think that this is how the story ends. However, it was just inferences and assumptions people were making that started getting passed around as fact. And that led to a lot of people, even to this day, betraying their lack of experience with the game. And I'll tell you what, I've had many people over the years comment on those Last of Us videos, or the big 5-hour video I did on The Last of Us Part 2 going through the whole story. And they'll comment stuff like, oh, I can't forgive them for making the player kill Ellie, which is factually false. And it usually tells you that this person is just echoing what they heard 3-4 years ago in these leaks that they assume is fact even to this day. And it kind of shows that they aren't really interested in what's true, just in justifying their hatred for the game, even if it's not factually accurate. And perhaps the most common thing that people still get wrong to this day that I see all of the time is a misunderstanding that leaked also during this time period of somebody just assuming something, putting it in one of these summation posts, and then it got spread as if it was fact. And that is the claim that Abby was in fact trans, and that her killing Joel was supposed to be some statement or something or other. I don't really understand what the connection is, but people saying that was basically the case. And as you can see, even in this article, which again is collected from the Wayback Machine going back to June 20th of 2020, where in this very article, there's a description 12 hours in, that's how far Paul had gotten into the game. Ellie is gay, she has a girlfriend who is her traveling companion. Abby is likely trans, a villain, and a complicated character, which isn't actually true. She's not trans, but that was something that was leaked, and then that was something that was echoed and assumed as fact. And as a result, to this day, I still get comments from people saying that, oh, well, I'm not playing that game, it's woke garbage because Abby is trans or blah, blah, blah. And it's just frankly not true. But it shows you immediately that the person is not, again, concerned with what is actually factually true. They're just trying to justify their hatred of this game because there's characters in it that they don't like, and they want to justify their hatred in this way, even if it means that they're not actually reflecting reality. And so all of this framed The Last of Us Part 2 in a very strange way in the lead up to the game's launch in the middle of June of 2020. Hardcore fans were really anxious that all of these leaks were in fact true, and that they were going to see Joel die, and that they would be forced to kill Ellie. And other people were motivated to hate on the game because it allegedly included people within communities they didn't like, in addition to the general frustration from fans, which was that this game was not actually going to give the same emotional feeling as the original, which was a somewhat satisfying story of a father figure protecting who is sort of his proxy daughter as they navigate a difficult and deadly world together, with him eventually saving her from certain doom, although that doom also potentially damned all of humanity to continue living in this hellscape. The Last of Us Part 2, on the other hand, promised to be a game about hatred. And all of this was just built on a foundation of angst, because going all the way back to 2016, December 4th of 2016 is when this article was posted to Kotaku. They said, quote, "The first game was really about the love between two characters. This story is the counter of that," Druckmann explained. "This story is about hate, through Ellie this time. The first game you play as Joel, this game you play as Ellie." And shocker, when you have a fan base built up on a game by your own attestation about love, and then you make a sequel that's all about, again, by your own attestation, hate, fans might not respond in the same way. And this brings us to the first common complaint that I've seen with regards to The Last of Us Part 2, and that is simply that this sequel is unnecessary. And I think this is actually totally valid. The Last of Us Part 1, I think, tells a comprehensive story with two characters that have a strong character arc together, and they land with a better understanding of each other, though their relationship is still very confused and conflicted. In a lot of ways, I think the cliffhanger at the end of The Last of Us Part 1 is extremely well done and leaves a lot of room for the player to fill in the gaps of the characters' relationships and how this story could have continued on. After Ellie's iconic final line before the credits roll, the player is left to try and figure out whether Ellie actually has accepted Joel's statement, even though she doesn't believe it, if she's going to choose to just go with it so that they can live a peaceful life within Jackson, or if this is going to spark some sort of dynamic between them that could be more destructive, as we saw play out in The Last of Us Part 2. Furthermore, the player is also able to imagine a world where everything ends relatively happy, or at least as happy as it could have for these two characters that have had very tough lives. They go to Jackson, they live out the rest of their days within that community, they go hunting together, they clear out infected that migrate towards Jackson, and they live out a simple and yet fulfilling life. And honestly, sometimes I think stories are better left just like that. You leave it up to the player or the viewer or reader or whoever's imagination and let them fill in the gaps, let them fill in the rest of the story. Sometimes I think writers can write too much, and I think it can get them into some trouble sometimes. I've told this story before, but when I was in college, I took a playwriting class, and the playwright/teacher, he said something which I think is very appropriate in the realm of video games, and it was simply that bad writers write a lot. Expert, master writers right enough. And I think that that's the core difference here. I think the prospect of The Last of Us, with the amazing sales it had and with how beloved the franchise and the characters were, frankly, Naughty Dog and Sony looked at it and were like, hey guys, I think a sequel is gonna do really well. So if we could just maybe put that together, make that happen, let's do it. And that sort of blinded them to the question of whether they actually should be doing this, whether it was the right thing for the story, whether it was the right thing for the community. And as a result, they told a story which I think is grounded within the world of The Last of Us Part 2, but it's a story that I think was bound to upset the player base. And speaking of that story, let's move into the second point, which is the death of Joel being poorly handled. I think everybody expected Joel to probably die in this game. It just seemed like it was the natural place for the story to go. You want Ellie to be the playable character. You have to have some reason for the player taking control of Ellie over Joel, so it only makes sense. Something happens to Joel. And I don't think the core fan base would have necessarily been that upset. Like, they would have been bummed that he was dying and being killed off, but I think they would have understood it, at least mechanistically, within the game. The problem for most players is that Joel's death is extremely brutal. They are forced to watch it just like Ellie is, and then they're forced to control the murderer for well over 10 hours of gameplay, all while the writers are actively trying to manipulate the player into having sympathy with Joel's killer so that they realize she's not actually that bad, and maybe Joel did have it coming if you look at the situation from a different perspective. And again, as a concept for a video game, I think this is really cool. I think it's really compelling in a lot of ways to have a situation with two characters that are beloved by fans, and then to just take a different view. Instead of looking at it from their perspective, look at it from a different perspective and realize that they are like mass murdering psychopaths who have killed dozens and dozens, if not hundreds and hundreds of people, all in the pursuit of the protection of one life over the rest of humanity. Like, it's a really interesting dynamic, and I think it makes sense within the story. But again, I don't blame players for not wanting to go along with it. In my opinion, humans are extremely tribalistic creatures, and we have sort of evolved to avoid taking different perspectives, but rather to stick with our tribe, even if maybe they're not totally in the right, just so our tribe is better off. You see this behavior reflected in politics, in religion, in sports, everywhere you look, people do this. And I mean, hell, even in the console wars, you see this, where Xbox might do something stupid or PlayStation might do something stupid, and yet their fans refuse to acknowledge it, just sticking their fingers in their ears going la la la, because they don't want to acknowledge that their team might be in the wrong. I think it's something so innately deep within humans that it's got to be like biological or something. I'm not a biologist, I don't study sociology, but it just seems to be such a common thread, no matter where you look in human life, that it's gotta be deep within us. And so in my opinion, while it's an interesting idea for the game and for the story to try and push players into looking at the situation from a different perspective and realizing that pretty much everything that Ellie and Joel did, they're gonna mirror with Abby, and then make you realize that these characters are kind of doing the exact same thing throughout their stories, and that makes them equal, and yet for some reason you're rooting for this person above this person over here without exception. It's a cool idea, but I don't think it was ever going to be widely accepted by the broader public. I think it was always going to be received pretty poorly by probably half of the players. And like I said earlier, the way that Joel is killed, I think makes sense within the world of The Last of Us Part 2. Honestly, Abby's father having been brutally murdered by Joel, and considering Joel also killed dozens of the Firefly guards within the hospital building as well, who Abby potentially also knew, I think it makes sense that when she finally found Joel after all of these years, and she had the chance to enact her revenge, she would make it slow and painful. I think that lines up because frankly, that is exactly what Ellie wanted to have happen when she found Abby at the very end of the game. It's what Joel did time and time again whenever anybody stood between him and Ellie, as we saw him straight up torture people in David's camp during the winter section of The Last of Us Part 1. So this is something, again, where they've taken elements of these stories, directly parallel them so that you can see all of these characters kind of screwed up and doing the same thing. And that means that they're all roughly on the same level. But again, just because something makes sense in a sort of narrative, artsy way does not mean that the fans or the gamers will find it fun or entertaining to the point where they are rooting for like a character that they just watched murder a beloved other character. So while I can understand the frustrations over how it happened, and they feel that maybe Joel deserved a more honorable death and that maybe he should have been like mauled by infected or something, whatever more honorable would have been, I just don't think that would have made sense in the context of the universe we're dealing with. So in my opinion, this one is a little less valid, because if you're gonna kill off Joel, other than him getting swarmed by like a rat king or something, I think that this probably makes the most sense within this dark and horrible world that The Last of Us Part 2 is set in. But in my opinion, another very valid concern and frustration to have with The Last of Us Part 2 is how they handled the marketing. Okay, this one's really weird, so buckle up in case you don't remember it. In the lead up to The Last of Us Part 2, they had a bunch of trailers that they put out. Some imply that you'd be playing as Joel. Others, like the original announcement of the game with Ellie playing the guitar, clearly hinted at Ellie being the focus of this game's story. However, there was one particular trailer which left players assuming that Joel would be a playable character, or at least stay within the story for an extended period of time. And it was this one right here, where Ellie gets grabbed, turns around, and then sees Joel standing across from her, when he actually has a line of dialogue that he reads off as well.
What the hell are you doing here?
You think I'd let you do this on your own?
Now the problem is that that's not in the game, like at all. It's actually a different character. It's Jesse. And this for me has always been a weird spot, because on the one hand, like, did they actively cause harm? I don't think so. I think it's just like, oh, I could have sworn I saw Joel in like a grassy green area that's much later in the game, because Jackson is all snowy. So to see a trailer where Joel is in a green grassy area implies that he's going to live past the snowy section, right? And so when you see him die in the snowy section, you're like, but we saw him in a trailer in a different area. So is it going to be a flashback? Is it going to be like a flash sideways, like Lost? Like, what are we doing? And then it turns out that they just straight up did a model swap and flipped it to make players think that Joel was going to live longer than he actually did. And I think in the context of the broader events of The Last of Us Part 2 and the lead up to its launch, it makes more sense, because of course they weren't planning on a leak occurring. They assumed players would buy the game, start playing, and then after 2.5, 3 hours, Joel gets killed, and it's such a shell shock, because they were assuming Joel was going to be playable in a later section when everything was green and grassy and beautiful. And so when all of a sudden Joel's dead, they're all the more shocked by it. I think that's what they were going for, but after the leaks and everything, it just feels all the more dishonest. But this isn't anything necessarily new. Naughty Dog famously lied to journalists and press in the lead up to The Last of Us Part 1 all the way back in 2013, saying that you would only be playing that game as Joel, that Joel was the only playable character, blah, 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 which made the surprising switch to Ellie's perspective, partially through the game, all the more shocking and interesting when players got there. And so on the one hand, I think it's an interesting marketing ploy to just like straight up lie to people and be like, yeah, this is the playable character. And then you're all the more shocked when you can play as this character. A similar thing could have been done with other games like maybe Spider-Man 2 or God of War Ragnarok, where you just kind of lie through omission, or you just straight up lied saying that this is the only playable character, and then it ends up being more expansive than you thought. I think it's interesting, but it also makes me feel really uncomfortable, because if we're just gonna like open the door to companies being able to just straight up lie to you about game features and story elements, I'm not comfortable with that. Like, I don't like it. So it's something I can understand why they did it, but I don't like it, because again, it opens that floodgate to just companies lying to you and being like, well, we had a good reason to. I know we said that there weren't any like microtransactions in the game, and there are, but we did it for a good reason, because you wouldn't have bought it otherwise. Like, I don't want to open that gate. So I'm just, that's where I'm at. I feel uncomfortable with it. Another thing I find very uncomfortable is the story's structure. This is, I think, the most valid frustration and criticism that can be levied against The Last of Us Part 2, and that is that the pacing is all over the freaking place, and not in a good way. You see, pacing as it relates to video games is sort of multifaceted. It has to do with how certain combat encounters are stacked with slower sequences of narrative exposition. It has to do with how story beats are dealt out and how the game's emotional roller coaster track is laid out. What this usually takes the form of is in the context of a game like The Last of Us Part 2, you want to make sure that heavy emotional moments like the death of Joel are balanced out by quieter moments so that players have time to reflect on everything that just happened. A fantastic example of good pacing would be in The Last of Us Part 1. Right after Sarah's death in the opening section of the game, they have an extended and surprisingly long introductory title screen that plays out all of the credits of who made the game and the developers and producers and actors and all of that stuff as it plays out, giving players a solid 90 seconds or so to process emotionally what they just witnessed. Another example would be later in the game after Ellie kills David and you have this emotional bonding experience between Joel and Ellie, and then there's a cut to black as it transitions into spring. After this incredibly intense moment, the game goes to a quiet walk along an abandoned highway where Joel and Ellie are talking to each other, and yet there's this weird tension and distance between them, even though they've clearly increased their bond since the last time we saw them interact. This quiet moment contrasts very well with the hectic moment just before it, and it gives players time to calm down and also process emotionally everything that's happened between the player and the characters themselves. And in addition to all of this, sometimes pacing is just tied up in how long the game is, because some games are just frankly too long and would be better if they had elements cut. With The Last of Us Part 2, the pacing is notoriously horrible. The opening of the game is surprisingly slow. It really crawls, and if you've ever played the game multiple times, you know exactly what I mean. The first time you're going through it, especially if you knew of the leaks beforehand, you are sort of awkwardly walking on eggshells, dreading the moments to come. And then when it occurs, you sort of breathe a sigh of relief that it's at least over now and you can start focusing on the game, since now you don't know what's going to happen next. But on secondary run-throughs, it's all the more clear how slowly the game gets started. And it's also surprising that they switch perspectives very early on. You see, The Last of Us Part 2 doesn't actually have you swap to Abby halfway through as the leaks suggested. The original leaks, as collected here on Reset Era, that originated mostly on 4chan, described the game basically as you playing through it as Ellie and then reaching roughly a halfway point and then having the perspective switch to Abby, and then you spend the second half of the game hunting down Ellie. Oh my god, there's so many like Abby, Ellie, Jesse. I'm surprised it's not Jolie or something. Like, there's all these E names, and I keep switching them up, and then we redo the take, and I've probably screwed it up a few times. I don't know. Bear with me, guys. But this isn't actually how the game works. How the game works is actually more like this, where you have sections where you pop in as Abby, if you think of whatever is on top of the graph is what you're playing as. So you open up playing as Ellie, and then you swap to Abby for a little bit, and then you go back to Ellie, and then you swap back to Abby for another little section, and then you play as Ellie for an extended period of time, roughly to the halfway mark, and then you switch perspectives back to Abby, and then it swaps again, and the player will start to play as Ellie once again all the way through the end of it. It swaps all the time, and it actually swaps for the first time very early on in the game, which I don't know if that was a good choice or a bad choice, because it immediately causes players to get this sense of doom and like not even anticipation, it's like dread, more like, where you know most likely what's happening. You hear them talking about like, did we find him? Is he here? We got to do it. He's here for sure. His brother's here. You know who they're looking for, especially if you heard the leaks. And so the whole opening section of the game is sort of like you playing it, but you really don't want to play it, and you know what's happening, but like you don't want to see it. It's just dreadful in the purest sense of the word, that it's full of dread. After Joel's death, there are some very slow sequences where, of course, they're trying to frame the emotional processing of this terrible event, but it's also just really, really slow. And then they go and have you play as Ellie going to Seattle. And then there's sequences where there's flashbacks as if things weren't convoluted enough already. And then you go through some more gameplay sequences. And then eventually they swap perspectives again, play through a huge chunk of the game as Abby during the same time period, but just from a different perspective. And then you swap back to Ellie. It just gets really convoluted. And honestly, like, games are tough enough to balance with pacing when you have one playable character or two, and you're just trying to go through the story and pace the story well enough. It's way harder to do that when you have two playable characters and basically two timelines that interweave and interact with each other, and different locations that are played from different perspectives. So you're like, I went through this section of the game as Ellie and killed everybody, but that happens in the future because this is a flashback, and it just starts to break your brain. And I don't think it worked as well as they were hoping. Like, it's kind of a cool idea again, but it doesn't necessarily make for the best video game. And in addition to the bad pacing, there's another much more damning problem for The Last of Us Part 2, and that is the emotional strain put on the player. The best way I can describe The Last of Us Part 2 is that it is emotionally exhausting. Like, you go through 5 hours of it and you just want to go shower with water as hot as the sun, sobbing in a corner, and it just doesn't really work, but you keep trying. That's what the game wants you to do every few hours, because just when you think you've seen something horrible enough, you see something more horrible. And then you're like, okay, well, the disembowelment was really rough, but I'm sure it can't get worse than that. And they're like, no, okay, actually, we're going to have somebody who's pregnant get murdered in front of you, and you're basically going to do it. You're like, oh, wasn't on my bingo list. Okay, I guess we'll keep going. And then okay, that's cool. But then we're also gonna have you go and basically commit genocide on this village of these Scar people that are technically within a cult, and it's gonna be this whole thing. It's like an invasion, but it's okay because they're bad, because we said they're bad. It just keeps getting worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. And honestly, after all of that, the game then transitions to what seems to be an epilogue, even though it's just the real ending. You think the story is ending, you think everything is wrapping up, and once again, there's another round of emotionally taxing stuff when you think the ending is about to be happy with Ellie and Dina and the baby in this farmhouse. And then Ellie screws it up once again, runs off trying to find Abby. And again, just when you thought it was bad enough, they toss in slavery, and it just gets worse and worse. It kind of reminds me of Outlast 2, if you ever played that game, where it really felt like a game designed by hat. They took everybody in the studio, said, okay, write down on a Post-it note the most horrible thing you can think of. And then you write that down, and then you fold it up, put it in a hat, and then they just say, okay, we're going to draw from the hat to see what we put in the game today. Just kidding. Everything. And it's just horrible all the way throughout. I get it. They're trying to make a terrible world and show how terrible it is. But at some point, I just don't want to experience it anymore. I play video games as an escape from reality. I don't necessarily want to be reminded of all of the worst parts of reality and humanity when I play those games. Maybe elements of it, ground the story in those ways. But at some point, I just would rather do something else. And I think that's where a lot of players ended up. A good friend of mine tried playing The Last of Us Part 2, and he's a sweetheart. He doesn't like going through really sad or depressing films or games or anything, because he plays these games for a fun escape. And after a few hours of The Last of Us Part 2, he was just like, I'm done. I'll go play Monster Hunter. It'll make me feel happy. This makes me want to eat a gallon of peanut butter and cry into a pillow. And honestly, it seems like that was the entire motivating goal of The Last of Us Part 2, was to just make you feel kind of terrible by the end of it. And there's no real emotional payoff. It's just kind of okay, game's over, credits are rolling, everything sucks, okay? And everybody's left feeling worse. And I totally think this is absolutely a legitimate criticism, which is that it's artsy, and as an artistic thing, The Last of Us Part 2 is very, very good. But in terms of a game that you're playing for entertainment and fun and satisfaction and joy, it is an absolute dumpster fire. But beyond this, the rest of the game is actually very, very good, and I will insist on that till the day I die. The acting within the cutscenes is top-notch, again, rivaling anything I've seen in TV shows or movies anywhere. It really is phenomenal. The music is also incredibly well done, and the gameplay, frankly, in my opinion, takes on even the best of the third-person action-adventure genre, introducing also incredibly robust stealth mechanics and AI that has not even come close to being taken down by another game since. Like seriously, in The Last of Us Part 2, if there's an NPC enemy that you shoot, the other people within that group, the other enemies on the map at that time, know who that is. They'll call out, "Rachel! Oh my God, no, I see her!" And they'll start calling out for help. They'll start shouting for their friends, for the people they're on patrol with, to come and help over where they are. They'll start to learn your behaviors. If you start hiding underneath all the vehicles, they can communicate that to each other and start looking under the vehicles first and foremost. It is shockingly good. And again, it seems like nobody else is even coming close to this or even trying. As I said at the top of the video, there's a lot of stuff that The Last of Us Part 2 does better than a lot of other games, or really any other game that I've ever seen. It's just weighed down by this albatross of misery and woe that the writers seemed obsessed with getting out there. And it reminds me of people in college, like in that playwriting class I mentioned earlier. There was one person who just seemed obsessed with writing the most depressing play you could possibly write. Like they wrote a play where like somebody is trapped in a cave and then also ends up pregnant, and then they have to deliver the baby, but the baby's eaten by wolves, and then the wolves come and then like slowly consume the mother, but then they break out and she's saved by a man, but then the man goes and like sells her into slavery. And it was like, you're just trying to make like the most depressing, insane story possible. This isn't compelling. It's just horrible. And I feel like at times with The Last of Us Part 2, it's like, you're not necessarily trying to tell the best story, or maybe tells a story or communicates the message in the way you want it to be communicated. Instead, you're just trying to come up with like the most upsetting thing you could put on screen. And I don't like it. I'm tired of that. I'm good. So listen, I know this video is in defense of The Last of Us Part 2, but because I'm not a like hyper fanboy or anything, I'm always going to have a more nuanced position than just, nope, the game is actually amazing, full stop. It's always more complicated than that. I think The Last of Us Part 2 does a lot of stuff really well, and I hope that Naughty Dog has learned from some of the feedback they got from The Last of Us Part 2 when it launched. But, you know what, time will tell, I suppose. What we do know is that The Last of Us Part 2 is one of the most awarded games in all of gaming history. For a while, it was the most awarded game in all of gaming history. And I think that's because artistically, it's incredibly impressive and I think pretty well done. But as a video game, it leaves a lot to be desired from fans. So I guess time will tell if Naughty Dog will actually change. But if they want to stay rooted in their ways, they can probably justify it internally because, again, the game was incredibly well received by critics and it also sold very, very well as well. So, I mean, if they want to just keep doing this type of game, they can do it, and I'm sure they can make a really good argument to the people holding the purse why they should be allowed to do it that way. But we'll see. I mean, I don't expect Naughty Dog to go out and make another like Jack and Daxter game or something, but I guess we'll see. One thing we do know is that The Last of Us Part 2 is getting a remaster here in just a few days, which is going to be interesting. They're not only doing that, but they're also dropping a documentary on the creation of the game, which is going to be really interesting. I'm very excited to see that. Who knows, maybe we'll make another video covering some of the stuff we learned in that, because that's going to be wild. I'm very excited for that. And then we're also getting a new roguelike mode and some lost levels to see stuff that was intended to be in the original game that was cut for one reason or another, and that's going to be super cool. So if you're a Last of Us fan, it's going to be a pretty good week, I think. But you know what? I want to know in the comment section if you guys want them to make a Last of Us Part 3. I already think that The Last of Us Part 2 was an unnecessary sequel. In my humble opinion, that's kind of where I've landed after these years of reflection, but I want to know what you think. Do you think that a Part 3 could actually make more sense now? Or do you think that they should just leave it be and start on a new IP or something? I insist I would kill for them to do a pirate game. Like, my pitch has always been a realistic Naughty Dog grounded game set in the golden age of piracy, where you play as Anne Bonny, follow her story through the golden age of piracy. It could be amazing with the production quality that Naughty Dog could put forward. I pray that they do that at some point, but I guess time will tell. But with all that said, thank you for watching. I love you all dearly. And if you want to see more content from me for whatever reason, you can go check out Luke Stevens Live, which I'll have linked below in my link tree. And it's basically a collection of all my live streams, live stream clips, and pretty much any videos that I make that just don't end up here on the main channel, I put over there. But with all that said, thanks for watching. I love you all. I'll see you in the next one. Hugs and kisses. Bye-bye.